Energy transition and mining, it's a massive topic, obviously. Joining me from left to right, we have Angie Beifus, who is Global Mining and Metals Lead Analyst with EY. We have Alberto Migliucci, I've been practicing that, Founder, CEO at Petra Commodities Asia, and Peter Albert, who is CEO and Managing Director at 29 Metals. I think the first thing that we wanted to tackle in this was the actual demand scenario. A lot of talk out there about what is required for the energy transition, a lot of forecasts being made. How much metal are we short of, and where are these, which are the metal baskets that are in most critical demand? And maybe we'll start over with Peter, who will tell us about copper.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. So a few thoughts. One is we talk about consensus and what is the consensus in terms of the commentators and the forecasters, and it's very difficult to get a clear line there. We track that all the time in terms of the commodity space that we're in, and it's primarily copper and zinc, and we have some byproducts, but those are the primary ones. And the consensus can be down here to up there, so it's never quite clear. But what we do think we know is that in order to drive or to support the world's drive to net zero and decarbonisation technologies, you've just got to have more of everything. And in our space, it's primarily copper. And of course, we're talking critical minerals, and some spaces, copper is a critical mineral. It's Dr. Copper, they call it, and it's the barometer for the economic condition of the globe, and has been for more than a couple of decades. So in terms of what is the outlook from our perspective to support that decarbonisation, net zero, you've just got to have more of whatever it is. And in our space, critical minerals and copper, you need a lot more of it now. In terms of some of the numbers, Chris, I think commentators talk about a global consumption today of sort of 20 to 24 million metric tons per annum, doubling over the next 10, 15 years. Angie will have better numbers than I have at her fingertips, but very, very significant growth to support the technologies, not just the technologies in terms of solar and wind power, etc., but also all the infrastructure that goes with that to deliver the electrons at the end user. I might just stop there. I've probably taken up too much time and let you pass it on to somebody else.
Alberto, I might just skip over and go to Angie, given that Peter dropped you in it and said that you're going to have numbers at your fingertips. Maybe a few of the key points on some of the research you've been doing at EY and what that all looks like more holistically outside of just the copper story.
Sure. I guess maybe going back just a step, we've been doing quite a lot of energy modelling at EY, actually having a look at sort of what's driving that demand in the future. And so the first question, I guess, was around, is there consensus? And I think there isn't really consensus on how much, that's for sure, but I think there's a lot of consensus in terms of it'll be a lot. And I think it's working out, like, how much will that be? What's the speed of that going to be? And then also, really, who's going to be the winners out of that is also, I guess, a question. And then when the modelling that we did sort of looked at a few different factors. So we looked at technology, we looked at kind of consumer adoption, we looked at government policies, and then also commodity supply, like what's kind of driving supply. And when you have a look at all of those factors together across the world, it's really a regional sort of, every region, every country is probably a different energy transition, just with the interplay of those factors, with economics, with what geopolitics looks like in terms of those countries' ambitions. So I think there's a lot of different things that are going to drive it, but ultimately, even in our most kind of muted or subdued scenario, we call it the current trajectory, which is really sort of a business as usual scenario, there is a huge increase in demand. I mean, from EV sales of 13% today to 55 by 2030, 6.5 times the amount of renewables by 2050. So just a huge amount of new technologies coming in. And I think that will really drive demand for not just, critical minerals, but also, as Peter said, copper and steel, aluminium, all of which are required in renewables and EVs.
So for the last 200 years, mankind or humankind has relied on pretty much one fossil fuel, one source of energy, which was fossil fuels. And then all of a sudden in the last decade and the next few decades, we've got to turn all that on its head. And that's a big task because since the Industrial Revolution, it's always been fossil fuels. And all of a sudden, the fabric of our society has to change. So when you hear about these forecasts by 2030, 2040, 2050, they are all wrong. Every single one's wrong. I mean, I used to be an investment banker in the good old days when you could actually forecast things where there wasn't that much volatility. And I'd get up to a conference like this and show this is what Goldman Sachs says about nickel going forward next 12 months. This is what Credit Suisse says, what Macquarie Bank. And then the year later, I'd get those results. I'd have to change the names to protect the innocent. And they'd all be wrong on any commodity. So whatever forecast you see today on any of those commodities, I'll take the Pepsi challenge that next year we could be sitting here and they'll be all wrong. So it's a big task. It's a hard task. It's an enormous task. It's an impossible task. So how do we, and then you look at battery configurations for EV. Who can tell me now what battery configuration there'll be for commodities in the next 5 years? That's a tough one. Is it more manganese? Is it less cobalt? Is it more nickel? Is it more aluminium? And just to put it in perspective, like the typical lithium-ion battery for a 60 kilowatt-hour capacity battery that's used in a car is 185 kgs of minerals. That's a lot. So out of that, most of it's nickel, graphite, cobalt, lithium, copper. It's kind of hard to have a demand forecast for all those because the configurations change. So I actually think there will be demand because we're trying to restructure the fabric of our energy society. So there is, but how fast or slow it goes, that's a difficult question. So the thing is, with demand, you've got to see which minerals are probably the ones that doesn't matter which technology changes are going to be the successful ones. And I think Peter's onto a pretty good one. But I think that might be late on your supply side comments, so I'll leave it at that. But.
I want to make a couple of comments there, Angie and Alberto. So and again, a bit of focus on copper. And Angie talked about how many percent increase on EVs over the next 10 years or so. An EV vehicle requires 55 kilograms of copper. An internal combustion engine requires about 22 kilograms of copper. A megawatt of power for solar or wind turbine requires about close to 3 tons of copper. Coal, natural gas is about 1.1 tons of copper. So the transition to these technologies, and whether it's EVs or whether it's energy generation through solar or wind power, just requires that much more. And I'm using copper because I know copper, but other minerals like Alberto was talking about, the same sort of outlook has to be there. And what we're starting to see is we've seen a pretty, and again, sorry for the copper focus, a pretty stable copper price over the last year or so. Not a bad copper price. Unfortunately, on the other side of the equation, inflationary pressures have squeezed margins. But now we're starting to see that copper price come up, and it's only going to go one way. And copper won't be on its own. There'll be other minerals there as well. But copper is the underlying commodity which drives these technologies.
Angie, a couple of points that I wanted to pick up on with you and the research that you've done. One, we're talking about EVs here. How much of a driver for metals in the energy transition is the EV story versus the other inputs here with the transition? And something for everyone, but maybe starting with you, Angie. When we're talking about what's needed on that point of all the minerals, John Ford this morning was looking at his forecasts and what he's looking at. He's talking about iron ore, given, I know I'll embarrass myself with the numbers, but it might be something like 5 tons or 50 tons or how many tons in a wind turbine. Does that make iron ore critical, an energy transition mineral? So firstly, Angie, that EV versus the other drivers? And then where are these minerals, and what will change in terms of what we see as an energy transition critical mineral?
I think copper is definitely, as Peter said, kind of the underlying. I mean, it's in everything. And you were mentioning sort of 3 tons in a wind turbine, but you take that wind turbine offshore, it's 8 tons, because of all the wiring that needs to come back to shore. So there's a huge amount of copper, but you're right. I mean, steel is another one where I think in the turbines we're talking about sort of 98 tons or something of steel to build a wind turbine. So that does lead to iron ore demand. But I guess on the iron ore demand, then you've got to think about decarbonisation and what is that going to mean for iron ore in terms of increased use of scrap and electric arc furnaces. So there is that kind of interplay there as well. I think lithium is probably, when you were talking about batteries, one of the things that really struck us is we started doing this modelling probably 18 months ago, and an NMC battery, which is one with manganese, cobalt, nickel, was prevalent. And so we only modelled on the basis of that battery. But within just the space of 18 months, the increase in the amount of production of an LFP battery has been huge. It's now 30%, over 30% of the market. And that's a lithium iron phosphate battery with more lithium, which makes it more critical, I guess, and particularly given the size of those markets and the need for them to scale.
Yeah, a few things on that. Firstly, the critical minerals, and there was some discussion about that today, but is coal a critical mineral? Probably not, but it's a critical industry, as you need that industry to get to the renewable targets you want. That's for the steel manufacturing, or even just the energy. I mean, for all these wind turbines or solar panels that are built, say, in China, they're using coal to manufacture those. So if you were to stop coal now, you will never get those targets because you haven't got the energy to produce those. Plus the steel aspect. All the nickel laterites in Indonesia being the biggest producer of nickel in the world, they have to process that laterite, and they pretty much mostly use coal. So I'm not saying coal is a critical mineral, but it's actually a critical industry. So there's a bit of a conundrum there in terms of what Angie said too. Just to put it in perspective, I know we always talk about lithium, and everyone must learn from lithium because lithium has got the marketing rights to all of this. Because if you look at a lithium-ion battery, they're actually probably the least, in terms of quantity, amount used in a battery. There's more manganese and copper and cobalt, but the lithium guys have got the marketing rights, which is pretty important. But when you look at, we always talk about EV, but I'm talking now bigger in terms of storage and infrastructure. If you take Queensland, for example, Queensland needs about 26 gigawatts of storage power, and they're currently building the hydro, and that hydro might be, say, 7 gigawatts of power. So there's an extra 19 gigawatts needed for storage. I can't think about how they're going to get their head around that when you've got one of the biggest hydro schemes going to be built that takes 7 gigawatts, and you still need another 18, 19 gigawatts of storage. So where's that going to come from? Is it going to be lithium batteries? We've seen, and if there's someone technical in the audience here, they can probably comment on this, but there's a train there. Steam train.
How many metals in an iPhone? That's a question for you.
That's a lot. But I can give you a breakdown of there's even gold in iPhones. The thing is, back on the battery storage, the large-scale battery storage, vanadium is probably a critical mineral that I would focus on in terms of there's that technology, the VRF, the vanadium redox flow battery. That's an Australian technology, and that's seemed to be doing well in terms of battery storage. So there's vanadium that would probably be one of the key minerals going forward.
Okay.
Yep.
Look at me, Chris. In terms of, I mean, we've talked about the demand side, and we're sort of starting to touch a little bit on the supply side. Of course, always got to look at both sides of the equation. And I made some comment earlier on about, inflationary pressures. Those inflationary pressures which we experienced over the last 2 years post-COVID, they're structurally embedded in our cost structure. They're not going to come out. So the margins get squeezed. If the prices don't get up, the margins get squeezed. And you can, not hard to look around and see multiple mines or multiple operators in different commodities who are struggling at the current, in terms of their profit margin based upon the squeeze that they're having in terms of inflationary pressures. When you put on to that the challenges with developing a new mine, grades getting lower, mines getting deeper, harder to find, and then the regulatory environment, which is becoming tougher and tougher wherever you are, and projects typically taking 10 years more to bring on board. That just drives an equation which can only lead to higher prices in terms of commodities. In order to, as long as you've got that supply side that we've talked about in terms of the decarbonisation, net zero, then the commodity prices under the current scenarios, unless something changes, dramatically changes, have got to have a lot of pressure on the price equation.
So we are going to devote a little bit of time to moaning about things like permitting, etc., which I think will be a common theme. Well, I think it's probably relevant and it's accurate to have a bit of a gripe about that. I wanted to hone in first on that. What are the critical minerals? And I think the factors around that in terms of becomes things might be in short supply, but the market might be tiny, so it doesn't really matter. It's out there and it doesn't take long to actually deliver it to market. Where are the areas that policymakers generally should be looking to that are and investors that are really, really critical in terms of large or relatively large markets and supply that simply isn't there for the near term through to the mid and long term? Angie, can I dare start with you?
Yeah, I think with critical minerals, and I think your publication actually did a good article on this a couple of weeks ago in terms of what are the critical minerals, and there's sort of, there's 6 that are sort of across all this. But when you have a look at those, a lot of them tend to be either in the battery mineral space or the rare earth space. And I think when you look at overarching, it is around demand supply, but I think at the moment there's a really big geopolitical factor in there in terms of how much either production or processing is in China. And I think a lot of focus from governments is really on what do we do about manoeuvring that either domestically in Australia, US, EU, Canada. Everyone has kind of the same focus on those minerals, and probably more so after the end of last year when there were export restrictions put on some of the rare earths and graphite from China as well.
Okay.
Just on that, the critical minerals, we're talking about the mining of that, but the bottleneck or the supply chain disruption or monopolies in China. So that's the issues. I can't off the top of my head remember the numbers, but something like 80% of all critical minerals are manufactured or processed chemically or mechanically or physically in China. They're not mined in China, but so that's an issue in itself, because when you talk about a critical mineral, there's a political component of it. It's actually a scarcity or disruption of the supply chain. So that's the disruption could be something happens with China, for example. An example of a true critical mineral in that sense is cobalt. 60 or 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So if something was to happen in that country, that's a serious supply squeeze. They'd be some pretty serious. I mean, copper as well is a critical mineral because there's not that many countries that actually produce copper. And as a geologist, I'll have to say that copper is quite hard as a metal compared to producing, say, a coal or bauxite or nickel laterite. So copper is also a critical mineral from a concentration point of view of which countries, but also from a geological point of view. In terms of also, and Peter might be able to speak on this, but the other thing is, with all this pressure on supply and more demand that we need, thousands of tons of copper or anything, it's not just a magic button where you just produce this stuff out of the ground. As a geologist, the grades get lower and finding costs get harder, which goes back to your permitting. So, geology rule number 101 is all the biggest and nicest deposits are always found first. They're the easy ones, right? The ones that are shallow, in a good location, and easy to extract, and typically high grade. As we go on, it's harder to find those big elephants. And they're usually in God-forsaken countries, or on the corner of some map that you didn't even know existed, or have permitting problems or social issues or political issues. So yeah, it's becoming a big issue. Yep.
I used to say that for talking about geologists, that all the deposits are within 200 metres of a main road.
That's right. That's right. The lazy geologists. Yeah. Now they're on the intersection of 4 maps.
Yeah, that's right.
The old days, you have to put them together.
So no, I can't really add to that, Chris. I might pose the question. Angie talked about 6 critical minerals, and pick up on Alberto's point there. I wonder if it's a moving feast. When there are geopolitical pressures or countries put constraints on particular commodities, that shifts the balance in terms of what is important commodities that we've got to focus on. So it may not be, it's E6 and it's E6 forever. It may well be that that moves over time.
I would agree with that. I mean, if you think in 2022 in Europe, coal was probably a critical mineral.
Yeah. And in Korea at the moment, South Korea, met coal is a critical mineral because they're steel industry. And in the US, uranium is a critical mineral because of political and so you're right, it's fluid, and it also depends on which country.
Moving on to the supply side of things and that piece around permitting, and you look at the agenda of this conference and you look at it at various conferences, and there's so much overlap because it generally, no matter what the driving forces are, one of the bottlenecks comes down to an understanding of how mining works, how critical it is as a foundation of civilization as a whole, but what we're trying to do at the moment. But we don't seem to be able to carry that through to policy. Where do you see socially humanity is in terms of understanding mining and starting to be able to release some of release that handbrake on developing some of the minerals that we need? Are we close, Peter? You look sceptical. It's
a loaded question, Chris. I mean, it's maybe it's a personal sort of commentary here. I mean, the people who live in the cities have no concept about what it really takes to get a ton of copper or a kilogram of cobalt or 2 tons of met coal. They've got no concept of that. And they're driving these policy agendas, and every government in the world, certainly many governments, are talking about critical minerals. In the US, the IRA, and all of those things, talking about it in this country. But translating that into policy, effective policy, which accelerates a approvals process, just isn't happening. It just isn't happening. And it doesn't make any sense. You can't have, on the one hand, all this phenomenal drive for net zero decarbonisation. Yeah. We need all these critical minerals. On the other hand, you've got these policymakers who are just some of them environmental warriors. Just totally against development. And how do you bring them together? I don't know the answer.
Yeah. That's a good point. There seems to be a big disconnect between what we need and what ideology or the politicians are saying, and also in financing. You look at the NVIDIA, the tech company in the US. It's got a $2 trillion market cap. When those guys make little microchips for AI, and $2 trillion, that's $25 billion more than the whole GDP of Australia. Right, that's bigger than the whole S&P energy index. This is one company that makes chips, right? Not those potato chips, which are probably more useful. But so it shows you that mining is a bit on the nose. There's companies in this forum, and Rick will mention this as well, that in the US, mining is a sort of a sin, I think he used the word. And you go to conferences like this where there's some great companies out there that do great work, and their market cap is $30 million. And you've got some guy's market cap is $2 trillion. And we're the benefit in society, So there's obviously, I hate to say this, but mining's not sexy, and it probably never was. And so there's a disconnect. And as Peter says, when we always have these debates about energy, most people in inner city Sydney or Melbourne think that electricity just comes out of a brick in your home. Right, plug it, there it goes. They don't realise that there's a whole process and mining behind all that. Doesn't matter which commodity you're using. And so, it's a big issue for our industry. Maybe that's where, as an industry, we lack as a PR / I mentioned this, I don't know if the words are advertising, but marketing, because the industry has to sell itself a bit better. Even amongst investors. I could go to Hong Kong and Singapore now and sell a widget high-tech manufacturing company that may never get off, but it's a great idea, and raise $200 million of capital for that in a very short time. But if I went out with looking for money for one of these commodities we're talking about, it's a hard slog. I didn't mention copper. I can sell copper.
I struggle a little bit about this, about marketing ourselves as an industry, because, in my space, we're talking about it for 25 years. Everybody's talked about it, much higher profile people than we've got on this panel, really senior people who have access to all sorts of resources and have been out there marketing mining resources, the importance of the commodities to the lives that we lead. And we're just not making a dent. We're just not getting through. So it's not for want of trying. It's just for want of listening.
Education, maybe.
Angie, anything to throw in there? Just at the risk of throwing fuel on the fire.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think there is a challenge around, obviously, the brand of the industry. And you're right, there are so many people out there talking it up, trying to get out there and how, before it was yours, it was mine, right? So trying to get that message out there. And it is challenging. And I think, I've found, though, over the last 2 years, and some of this is around energy transition, and as part of my work, obviously focused on mining within an energy and resources team, now everyone sort of thinks, well, mining is just about energy transition. And so I'm trying to say, well, actually, there's steel, there's copper, there are other metals. So I think there is a growing awareness that you do need mining for this, but I think it's obviously taking far longer than we would like.
That's a good point. It should be changed, shouldn't it? Because the whole thematic has changed. You've got to have these minerals to drive this energy transition. So it should be making a difference.
But I think it's trying to figure out how do we make sure that the value is seen in mining and not just in the renewables or the EVs where the market cap right now seems to sit.
And a lot of good people leaving the industry because of that, surprisingly. So I used to be a mining investment banker, where my portfolio was the oil and gas industry, energy, and the mining. So I had 2 solid portfolios globally, probably the 2 largest in the world, where I covered all oil and gas, LNG, and mining, which was gold and all the coppers and coal. Now with the whole ESG and saying no to some of the fossil fuels, the really experienced mining bankers that knew their stuff, their portfolio has decreased rapidly, because all of a sudden we can't touch oil and gas, we can't touch LNG, we can't touch coal. And Aaron Borg from SocGen's not here, but his world, I'm not a banker anymore, it's 10 years ago, but my world was this big. His world as a mining banker is this big now, which actually entails looking at every now and then a gold deal, which is good. Every 2 or 3 years, a copper or zinc or base, because they don't come up every year, right? You do no more coal deals, you do no more water. And now you're stuck with this lithium, EV, manganese, esoteric minerals, which when I was growing up as a geologist, there was no such thing as a lithium geologist or a cobalt guy. So this is a new industry, and bankers hate to take risk. They really hate it. So they don't want to be the first to finance some lithium carbonate, new technology, and they hate the opaqueness of the lithium market where it's not easily tradable, it's contracts. So what's happening is the world of mining finance has really been reduced to 1/10 of what it was 5-10 years ago. So a lot of those guys, including myself, have moved on to other positions or industries. So there's a lack of smart bankers now that actually will take a risk or understand this because they've been doing it for 10, 20 years. And, you know, I pity those guys, and that's the problem, is because when you haven't got bankers financing these projects, the wheels are going to stop at some point, or something's going to go out of sync. Right? Lack of supply, no investment in supply, so all of a sudden prices will just go crazy, and you go back to the silly season. So, I mean, copper's still good. Banks still love copper because you can trade it on the LME. It's been around since day dot. It's not easily substitutable. So copper is probably one of the exceptions. But I'd say most of the other minerals in this whole EV paradigm are kind of hard to grasp for a 101 bank.
Just not transparent
Yep.
enough yet. Yeah.
We have got some time up our sleeves, but I thought I'd pause and just open it up for any questions from the audience. We've got a mic going around. Please wait for the mic. Just introduce yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, John Holliday. Look, this is a question about market intelligence. It seems we have a really good long-term perspective on where things are going, but how could we improve our market intelligence so people don't get caught out like we've all been caught out by Indonesia suddenly producing cheaper nickel and the Chinese cutting back on lithium suddenly? So we go through these turbulent volatility. You know, it amazes me that people like BHP and Fortescue, Gina Reinhardt just didn't have good intelligence on these commodities. Have you got some comments on that, please?
Peter, it sounds like you might.
No, you're the wrong person. I would have go to Angie. She's the analyst.
That's Angie.
No, I thought the question was great. I mean, you're quite right. You know, there's some very big companies with huge resources. Why don't they get it? These things change so quickly, and not reading the tea leaves, perhaps, I don't know. But they've got masses of people in those organisations doing exactly that. So it beats me, John.
Angie, you see intelligence out there?
It always is after the fact. I think, as I said before, I think there is a lack of transparency in some of these markets. Just being smaller markets. I think the Indonesian thing, in terms of nickel, was happening, and we've sort of been talking about it for probably the last 6 months or so, but not before that. So I think, there was talk about China investing in more supply coming online, but there does seem to be, particularly with nickel, a bit of taken aback there, and particularly when you consider that the LME was already accepting Indonesian nickel, you think that there would have been more transparency, I guess, in that market.
Actually, just picking up on that. Sorry, Angie. That's good. I was working in Indonesia in about 2012, 2013, and the new laws were coming in about having to have domestic downstream processing. That was 10 years ago. Perhaps what tends to happen is people don't believe it. They don't believe it can happen. They don't believe they could build those smelters in the time frame that they have, and now they're paying the price.
Yeah,
Maybe.
no.
I don't know if that's the answer, but go on.
Totally agree, and great question. I was also working in Indonesia at that time with Peter, and I was doing all these nickel projects, which was basically, truck and shovel nickel out to North Asia. And when the Indonesian government put that rule in where they banned exporting of the raw material, it had to be processed, I was one of the first ones to criticise that. I thought, these guys are shooting themselves in the foot. Yeah. And I was happy to say that I've been proven wrong. And it's about that 10-year forecast. Here we are 10 years later and it works. And probably something which Australians have actually lacked of recently, maybe because of our change in government every couple of years. We haven't had a 10-year forecast. When the whole EV thing came out, and I remember writing an article in Forbes probably in 2015 on cobalt, I actually took a view that Australia could actually lead the world as the EV centre of excellence in terms, because we have the world's largest deposits of lithium, we have nickel, cobalt associated with that. We have manganese, we have bauxite for aluminium. So there's no excuse for Australia not to lead that, and no excuse for Australia not to set up a gigafactory, right? Queensland, northern Townsville, there was Q&I refinery up there, right? One of the largest nickel, cobalt refineries in the world. Deepwater port, close to Asia. There is no excuse whatsoever. So I'll let you decide what happened between now and then, but it is pretty bad management. I mean, someone's fallen asleep at the wheel, and now they're trying to, catch up. Like this morning, someone said that the government's sponsoring Arafura. Good luck to them. I mean, that's not going to change the needle, right? So we've missed that, because this is about global dominance. It's about who's going to dominate the next century of industry, of energy, of the car industry, the car manufacturers. Like whoever gets this EV paradigm right, it's up to now. Most of your cars either came from Europe. If you're really smart, you bought an Italian car. Joke, guys. Not a Ford Fiesta. So it's about car dominance too. Like there was the Japanese and the Koreans and American, Europeans. Now, whoever gets this EV paradigm right will probably dominate vehicles for the next half a century. So yeah, we've kind of fallen asleep on the wheel on that one.
Wait for the mic. Yeah, one down the front. It's on the way.
My name's Alan Lawrenson. You just mentioned Arafura. That's the first time we've heard about rare earths, I think, during your panel discussion. Comments about Australia's position, which has initially been quite strong and massive upside opportunities. Perhaps you'd like to comment on that.
Anyone?
I'll just quickly finish that because yeah, look, rare earths are obviously important for all these industries, but China controls most of the rare earths globally, and hence that's why something like Arafura is probably important strategically, because it's that critical mineral concept that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, and it was kind of like what I was saying earlier about cobalt. If you could find the cobalt project outside the DRC, it'd probably be wise to invest in it. And I guess the same goes with rare earths, because that's one of the, as Angie said, it's also one of those commodities that are quite opaque in terms of pricing. So most bankers don't like things like rare earths because they can't trade that freely on an exchange. And investors, the only way to get exposure to that is actually probably through investing in Arafura. Go ahead.
Arafura, Linus, or I think MP Materials, there are not that many outside China. Iluka, yeah.
I think we're, sorry, John, I think we're actually...
Follow-on question.
You might have to take it up with the guys after the after the panel. Peter, Alberto, Angie, thanks very much, but we are out of time. So please thank our panellists.